Welcome. Nikki will perhaps be joining us a little bit later in this recording, but I'm going to begin this afternoon, and for you it will probably be evening, with a story. Christine Pohl tells the following story. At 3 o'clock one morning, I woke to the sound of pouring rain. I was staying in the guest room of one of the communities of hospitality. Just outside my window, I could hear a chorus of coughing. Because the city had become exceedingly harsh in how it dealt with homeless people, about 30 men and women found refuge in the yard of this community every night. They must have been cold and getting wetter by the minute. An overwhelming combination of sadness and horror engulfed me. I looked around at my large and sparsely furnished room and realized that the only thing between 30 wet, cold people and a dry room was a locked front door. These people outside the door, coughing and wet, these people had names and faces. They were known to the people inside the house. They came into the house for meals during the day. How could we leave them outside when there were still corners of open space inside? Of course, I have lots of space in my own home, but I had never before felt so awkward about keeping it for myself. At home, during an ordinary day, I do not encounter any homeless people, and no one ever camps in my backyard because they have no other shelter. The next day I spoke to one of the women who had lived and worked in the community for 11 years. I asked her how she survived, knowing that the house could not take in everyone, knowing that although they provide a home for many people, some people were always left outside. How did she make peace with it and keep going? She responded, "You can never make peace with it, but you do the best you can." Paul says in this article from which the story is taken, offering hospitality requires the kind of courage that lives close to our limits, continually pressing against the possible, yet always aware of the inadequacy of our own response. Take a few minutes and think. Sorry, Mo, you're going to have to. Paul says this in the article from which that story was taken. Offering hospitality requires the kind of courage that lives close to our limits, continually pressing against the possible, yet always aware of the inadequacy of our own responses. It's quite a bit to think about. Do you think she's right? And if so, why? Think about it for a moment, and then jot down your response, and if you are able to, share it. I know that in our parish, every month we pack 40 parcels of groceries for families in need. It's a lot of work, which Mo and I do. We go and we buy the various provisions from a mega store, and then we go and buy vegetables from another mega store, and then a team of about 3 or 4 of us sit and they pack them. Afterwards, I phone my colleagues and I invite them to come and receive these food parcels which our parish gives with such love. As the last food parcel goes, I am still filled with a sense of great inadequacy, knowing the very, very large need that exists out there, and that this is just a little drop in the ocean. And yet, for some people, this little drop in the ocean is a lifeline in their constant battle against starvation. We're now going to consider sacrifice or mercy, purity or justice, a theme that we have already alluded to earlier. Beck points out that the tension that we experience between welcoming the other and excluding the other brings us back to the tension that exists between sacrifice and mercy. He argues that this tension is inherently psychological in nature. Jesus' action, he says, is all about the status of the heart. And Beck then poses the following questions. What kind of heart can eliminate socio-moral fissures, or the cracks and divisions, if you like, in our society? What kind of heart allows us to preserve communal integrity without demonizing the other? What kind of heart allows us to strive for purity and holiness without descending into the practice of scapegoating? You know this practice of scapegoating, don't you? It's called the deserving poor. Some people are poor, but because they try, they deserve our help. Other people are poor because they're just lazy and they don't get off their butts and do some hard work, and they're not deserving of our help. He finds the answer in the work of Miroslav Volf in his book Exclusion and Embrace. Volf writes, I want to concentrate on social agents, by which the social agent is you and I, somebody able to bring about change, or somebody operating in society at whatever level we operate in. Instead of reflecting on the kind of society we ought to create in order to accommodate individual or community heterogeneity or sameness, I will explore what kinds of selves we need to be in order to live in harmony with others. According to Beck, we have to deal with our psychological aspects of disgust and dehumanization, and we have to do so both as individual Christians and, of course, as a Christian community. That's not easy to do, as we are often blinded by our own community's deeply entrenched psychological biases and impulses. If you doubt this, then think of the resistance that is offered to the Black Lives Matter. And then people say, oh, but all lives matter. Or the Me Too movement. And they say, yes, but I as a man also experience sexism and I have been abused, etc., etc. And so we take away from the cry of the heart, which these movements aspire to, the cry for justice, the cry to be heard, the cry to be recognized, and for things to change. Now let us read Mark chapter 7, verses 14 to 16. Jesus then called the crowd again and said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Jesus sees the actions that flow from inside a person as that which is the source of evil. Sin is not some external practice of purity, but that which lies deep within our hearts. Beck says this, and I'm going to read it slowly, and I encourage you to do so as well. The call to hospitality will be superficial and fragile if it is not practiced by persons striving mightily to transform and reconfigure deeply entrenched psychological biases and impulses. More, these individuals will often be operating in the dark, as it were. Socio-moral fissures are often unconscious and outside of awareness. True people of welcome will attempt to penetrate into this darkness within themselves. But the self-deceit inherent in introspection means that much within our hearts will remain dark and impenetrable. This darkness will continue to unconsciously influence our emotions, judgments, and behavior. In short, the only way forward for people of hospitality will be the assumption that they are psychologically compromised in various ways, even when they don't feel compromised. This skeptical stance towards the self may be the most important insight produced by our psychological approach. In other words, he's saying, be careful of yourself. What biases can you identify that prevent you from offering true hospitality. If we do this exercise truthfully, we will probably become uncomfortable with what we discover about ourselves. Only share what you are comfortable sharing. Henri Nouwen wrote this little piece. He called it Friendship in the Twilight Zones of Our Hearts. There is a twilight zone in our own hearts that we cannot see, he writes, even when we know a lot about ourselves, our gifts and our weaknesses, our ambitions and aspirations, our motives and drives. Large parts of ourselves remain hidden in the shadow of consciousness. This is a very good thing. We will always remain partially hidden to ourselves. Other people, especially those we love, can often see our twilight zones better than we ourselves can. The way we are seen and understood by others is different from the way we see and understand ourselves. We will never fully know the significance of our presence in the lives of our friends. That's a grace that calls us not only to humility, but also to a deep trust on those who love us. It is in the twilight zones of our hearts where true friendships are born. Isn't it a beautiful statement from him? It means, in other words, I must be free to be me with you. I must be free to be vulnerable and open in friendship, knowing that you are being free and open and vulnerable to me, and that you will see me better than I see myself. And you may even point out to me things that I would not like, and truths that I would dearly like to forget. But it is because you are my friend, and because I am your friend, that we can be there for each other. So you may want to explore the question that I have proposed, have set further this week with a friend or someone you trust. Our next area we're looking at is purity, consumption, and hospitality. What a combination of words. Because of the capitalist model we embrace throughout the world, we are consumers. We are consumers of food. We are consumers of clothing, games, entertainment. But we have also become consumers of religion and of people. We consume people by turning them into a nameless labor force and by turning them into sex objects, in other words, into commodities. In doing this, we dehumanize the other. We justify our practices of doing this through religion and culture. Hospitality reverses this way of being in the world because it is about welcoming and embrace. And welcoming embrace is completely different to commodifying someone. Paul says that hospitality serves, in fact, as an act of resistance, because the practice of hospitality is so significant in establishing and reinforcing social relationships and moral bonds. We notice its more subversive character only when socially undervalued persons are welcomed. In contrast to a more tame hospitality that welcomes persons already suited to the community, hospitality that welcomes the least and recognizes their equal value can be an act of resistance and defiance, a challenge to the values and expectations of the larger community. Bellow says that we must look at the way in which ancient culture of Israel regulated its tension between mercy and sacrifice by focusing on systems of contagion or pollution and debt. And when we do this, then we understand the radical nature of Jesus' hospitality. These systems of contagion or pollution and debt, he says, were at the heart of the world Jesus was born into. He writes, in Israel, then, as in other human societies, the symbolic system is organized first and foremost as a defense against the violence of contagion, the impurity of the confused and the formless. In other words, anything that threatens what society regards as normal becomes impure and contagious. If you can't categorize something or someone within your own symbolic way of understanding how that world operates and how everyday life is to be lived, then they become a threat. The rational organization of productive work and everyday life, he writes, therefore requires taboos relating to pollution and warding off the threatened danger which the pollution represents. The focal points of the symbolic system are centers of purity, from which is excluded the impure, the misshapen, the undifferentiated, anything that breaks down forms. Bellow refers to such centers of purity as centers of consumption. He identifies 3 centers in ancient Israel. He calls them the temple, the house, by which he means a group of kinspeople, and the sanctuary. Consumption means the consumption of food at meals, the consumption of bodies in sexual activity, and ideological consumption in religious sacrifice. Israel created purity laws for all these 3 areas. Jesus' violation of the purity laws was scandalous because it violated all 3 areas. Jesus thinks of purity in terms of justice, and he stands in the prophetic tradition in this regard. He thinks of it in terms of the debt tradition, as is seen in his teaching contained in the Lord's Prayer, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive the debts of others." This releasing or remitting of debts has both monetary and non-monetary connotations. Whichever way you look at it, it's about the restoration of an individual or a group into community. The failure to do this is an act of violence. Forgiveness and restoration are not about sacrifice. They're about a change in the heart. Or as our Ash Wednesday liturgy says, turn away from sin and believe the good news. Wolf says this: the pursuit of false purity emerges as a central aspect of sin. The enforced purity of a person or a community that sets itself from the defiled world in a hypocritical sinlessness and excludes the boundary-breaking other from the heart and its world. Sin is here the kind of purity that wants the world cleansed of the other, rather than the heart cleansed of the evil that drives people out by calling those who are clean unclean and refusing to make clean those who are unclean. With this understanding in mind, we are now better able to understand the symbolic action of Jesus in cleansing the temple, which you remember was last week's gospel. In it, Jesus says, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." This reveals that Jesus was standing in the prophetic tradition and claiming that God's rule symbolized by the temple was a rule of justice and love, not profit-making laws. Paul continues and says, strangers in the strict sense are those who are disconnected from basic relationships that give persons a secure place in the world. The most vulnerable strangers are detached from family, community, church, work, and polity, which is just another fancy word for governance. This condition is most clearly seen in the state of homeless people and refugees. Others experience detachment and exclusion to lesser degrees. When we offer hospitality to strangers, we welcome them into a place to which we are somewhat connected, a space that has meaning and value to us. This is often our home, but it also includes church, community, nation, and various other institutions. In hospitality, the stranger is welcomed into a safe, personal, and comfortable place, a place of respect and acceptance and friendship. Even only briefly, the stranger is included in a life-giving and life-sustaining network of friendships. We move now to look at the how of hospitality. In an article published in Vision magazine in spring 2002, Christine Poole points out that Christians are expected to exercise the ministry of hospitality as a response to God's grace. It is meant to be a natural part of living our lives and sharing our lives. She writes, "It is first a response of love and gratitude for God's love and welcome of us. Hospitality, which was once a part of the very heart of Christianity, has become sidelined, it's become institutionalized, professionalized, and neglected. Offering care has become replaced by practices of control, efficiency, and planning. Hospitality is inconvenient, and as Paul rightly notes, it is unpredictable and often inefficient. Can you imagine that? Inefficient. Strikes at the very heart of people who are wonderfully organized. It is not another program we tack onto our existing church life. It is difficult, but it is an absolute necessity if we want to grow and be a vibrant Christian community. Paul writes, because the practice has mostly been forgotten, and because it conflicts with a number of contemporary values, we must intentionally nurture a commitment to hospitality. It must also be nurtured because its blessings and benefits are not always immediately apparent. Because hospitality is a way of life, it must be cultivated over a lifetime. We do not become good at hospitality in an instant. We learn it in small increments of daily faithfulness. Hospitality, as we have already highlighted in Season 2, involves welcome. Welcome, says Paul, does not require many resources. It does not require a willingness to it does require a willingness to share what we have, whether food, time, space, or money. She also points out that congregations committed to ministering to people in need sometimes overlook their own greatest resources, the fellowship of believers. She goes on to say, churches have generally done better with offering food programs and providing clothing closets than with welcoming into worship people significantly different from their congregation. Because we are unaware of the significance of our friendship and fellowship, our best resources often remain inaccessible to strangers. I invite you to pause and to listen to this again and to think about it. If you have it in front of you in written form, reread it. I am left pondering the question, is this true of us at St. Mike's and at Reimsig? And if it is, how do we set about changing this? Paul links hospitality and community with the ability of the community to be trustworthy and truthful. Communities who know who they are and are comfortable with themselves, warts and all, are best able to offer hospitality. Indeed, Paul says, good hosts always recognize their own frailties and weaknesses. Hospitality to strangers, especially when practiced in community, has a way of laying bare our lives and surfacing our inadequacies. It is, however, precisely when we recognize our weaknesses that we are most open to God's mercy, grace, and healing. If welcoming others means offering them shelter and sanctuary in the deepest sense, then it can only be offered when a community knows this truth. In another article, Paul says, the fact that there is community in the church, that there can be fidelity, that God loves us, is an enormous assurance that even in our weakness and our failure, God loves us, that there's a place for us in the community. That's an amazing word to a society of isolated people who are hungry for community. The fact that we are called to truthfulness, to allow our vulnerabilities and our failures to be known, because the community will help us. The community will help us become better, become more good, become more holy. There's a promise there. There's a story there. The power of Christ who redeems us, who makes us new. We will pursue this theme of the how-to of hospitality further in next week's session. There is a meditation by Paul on open doors and closed doors, and it is a rather long meditation. I am not therefore going to read it to you, but I do encourage you to read on it and reflect on it before we engage with the last of our sessions next week.